All right, everyone, we are live. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's COVID-19 vaccine Q&A with Tompkins County Health Department and Northeast Pediatric. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, especially to our panelists today, Dr. Snedeker and Dr. De Silva. The Health Department, in collaboration with numerous healthcare providers from across the county, is really pleased to present to our community this series of Q&A opportunities regarding the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine. We will try to get to everyone's questions as they come in, but we will need to wrap up the session at 1 o'clock. If we cannot get to your questions today, we will be sure to address them at an upcoming Q&A event or at the town hall event, which will be happening tonight at 5 o'clock. That will be live streamed on our YouTube channel, and I'll put the link for that in the chat box in just a minute. The town hall event tonight will be with Public Health Director Frank Krupa, County Administrator Jason Molino, to just discuss vaccine distribution updates and other questions that may be coming in. If you do have distribution questions, we will not really be getting into that at this Q&A session. But we could certainly address those tonight. So do feel free to send those questions to me and I will add them to our roster for tonight's town hall. Today's Q&A will focus on questions about vaccine concerns and what getting the vaccine might mean for you and your family. Okay. I'd encourage everyone, if you have not already done so, to register for vaccine alerts with either the SWIFT 911 system, which could send you a call, a text, or an email, or you can sign up for the Tompkins County Health Department's vaccine-only email list. I'll put those links in the chat box as well. And if you have questions about vaccine distribution, you can find those answers, for the most part, on the County Health Department's website. You can also call our wonderful community friends at 211 with additional questions. All right, we will now begin our Q&A. You can submit your questions via the Q&A chat box. If you would prefer to speak your question out loud, I will allow time at the end of the session to do so. You can raise your hand, or if you're calling in, I will open your line as well to give you the opportunity to do so. We are recording the session to be able to share with others post-event. So just let us know if you would like your question to be private and we can remove it from the recording before we post the footage. And with that, I'd like to welcome again our doctors for today's office hour, Dr. Snedeker and Dr. De Silva from Northeast Pediatrics. So tell us, why are you here today and why did you feel it would be important to contribute to this community discussion?
I feel like knowledge is power, and the more we can help educate our community and our families about the vaccine, I know there's a lot of concerns and questions about it, the better I think people can make decisions and feel comfortable about those decisions.
I agree. And, pediatrics is all about preventive care and, trying to keep bad things from happening before they do. And that's what vaccination is all about. So it lines up very nicely with what we do all the time. And for myself, since I have a particular interest in infectious diseases and had a former life as a virologist before or actually early in my career as a pediatrician, I was also doing virology research. So I have additional experience with that is informative when it comes to evaluating some of these vaccines and thinking about development issues and safety issues and things like that.
Great. Well, maybe you can answer this first question then. Can you just tell us a little bit of background about what's in the vaccine, what is the vaccine, and how it was created?
Sure. The first thing is it's very important to understand that vaccine is plural. So there are a number of vaccines that are under development, and two have been allowed by the FDA to be used under what's called emergency use authorization, meaning that there's been enough data given the pandemic situation to release them. But there are quite a few others in the pipeline, and each vaccine has is different from the others. The two that are out there, though, are almost identical, and both use a technology called mRNA technology, where the vaccine actually contains RNA that codes for the virus spike protein, which is just next to my right ear. You can see those little projections coming out of the virus. And so the vaccine actually tricks the cells of your body where the vaccine is injected to make that protein, and then it's recognized as foreign by your immune system. You make antibodies to it, and those antibodies are part of what protects you, although there are other aspects of immunity that vaccines induce that are important as well. And as to the safety question, so the basis for the FDA allowing these vaccines to be used are clinical trials where tens of thousands of people, volunteers, have been given the vaccines, and then they've been monitored after that, both for side effects from the vaccines and also for the frequency at which they develop COVID illness, which is the basis for when you hear that the vaccine gives you a certain percentage of protection, that's based on comparing people who got the vaccine and people who didn't in the period afterward to see how often COVID illness developed, assuming that all of those people were being exposed to COVID at the same rate.
Jeff, I think you also had mentioned at some point that when people study the safety of vaccines, almost always if there's side effects or problems, they happen relatively quickly after the vaccine's given, so that you don't need years and years of safety studies.
That's right. I mean, it is important to do long-term follow-up because sometimes side effects don't become apparent right away until you've vaccinated millions of people instead of tens of thousands. Those tend to be very rare side effects, of course. But it's true that for every vaccine that we currently use, there is no vaccine that we know of that develops that causes any side effects that happen decades later. That largely it's either local reactions, pain at the site of injection and fever and feeling lousy and things like that. That can happen, although it isn't inevitable that that'll happen after vaccination. And within the first couple of weeks, there can be, because of the immunity that the vaccines are triggering, there can be immune manifestations that sometimes result in side effects. But those tend to occur within 2 to 3 weeks. And after that, thus far, no vaccine that we've ever used has caused longer term issues. And that appears to be true of these vaccines as well. But since these are newly developed and we don't have, they haven't been in use for years yet, they've been in use for months. So that, it's very important to continue to monitor for those sorts of signals. And the more people that get the vaccine, the more apt you are to be able to pick up side effects that might be rare, but potentially worth knowing about.
Great. Can you update us on the status of clinical trials for the vaccine with children? Where are we at with that?
Yeah, there's not too much to say there yet. So as most people know, the vaccines are approved for adults. In the case of the Pfizer vaccine, that means 16 and older. And in the case of the Moderna vaccine, it means 18 and older. And that's only because the companies that made them designed their studies that way. And so that's the only thing that the FDA has data on. Both vaccines are now being studied in children 12 and older. And actually the infectious disease group up in Syracuse is participating in those vaccine trials. And one of my patients is actually enrolled as a volunteer. But those studies will take several months to complete. And so I expect perhaps by April or May or maybe June that there will be enough data from those to have some information about safety in children and possibly effectiveness, although the numbers are smaller, so effectiveness information is going to be harder to get. There are currently no studies underway for these two vaccines in children under 12 yet, and that probably won't happen until the studies for kids 12 and older are completed, which means those studies won't even be starting until the summer, if then. And I've sort of heard rumors that the next group might be 9 to 12, so they're sort of creeping down to younger kids, and the studies in kids younger than that may not be until the end of the year. So of course, approval of those vaccines is going to require that those studies will be completed. One of the vaccines that's under development in England, the Oxford vaccine, that vaccine actually they are starting to study in children even before it's been licensed for adults, which I think is good news. As pediatricians, we hope these vaccines will be available for kids, and it's a little frustrating that the studies in children are not being done sooner.
Jeff, is that the Johnson & Johnson one?
No, that's a different vaccine.
Okay.
We have a question from an audience member that's along the same line, so I want to just throw it in here. Given so they're concerned about the potential for long-term health effects with the new mRNA vaccine for children. So are there other vaccines that are similar that we can kind of make predictions based off of, or is there any discussion about the potential for long-term health effects?
There aren't. These are the first vaccines of these kinds that have been used in humans. But the way that the vaccine works, the RNA that's injected persists in your body only for a few hours, and it's degraded very quickly. So after that, it's really like any other vaccine. The virus protein that's produced is sitting there for your immune system to react to, but the RNA is gone. So biologically, there isn't any reason to think that there ought to be any difference from any other vaccine in terms of the potential for long-term side effects. But that's hypothetical. Until you've actually done that sort of follow-up, you can't know 100% for sure.
I think sometimes some of the confusion comes about because people hear about RNA and DNA and genetics, and
right.
And RNA is not the same as DNA. It does not get absorbed or infiltrated into your own DNA, and so it's not something that your body can absorb and keep. It breaks down really easily. It has a single job, which is to code for a protein, and as soon as that happens, it's broken down.
Right. It doesn't change your genetic makeup in any way, even though RNA is a genetic substance. Right.
How about for pregnancy or unborn infants? What is the clinical trial updates on if the vaccine is safe for pregnancy, and if so, like what's the best time to get vaccinated if you are pregnant?
Yeah, there's very limited information about that so far. Pregnancy is usually, people who are pregnant are usually excluded from safety studies for vaccines when vaccines are first under development, because you want to make sure it's safe in regular people first, but that unfortunately means it takes longer to get vaccines approved in pregnancy. What information there is comes from these large clinical trials of tens of thousands of people where some women have happened to get pregnant, right after their first dose of vaccine, or didn't realize they were pregnant when they got the first dose of the vaccine. And so those numbers are pretty small, but so far no adverse events have happened in any of those situations. But if you really want to know, you have to actually do a study where you vaccinate enough pregnant women to be able to measure those sorts of outcomes. And right now that data doesn't exist, which makes it challenging to develop a recommendation for pregnant women. The AAP and the American Academy of Obstetrics and Gynecology have what's called a permissive recommendation. And that means that they are not saying that pregnant women should get these vaccines, but they are saying that they may, and that there's no reason to withhold them from any pregnant woman who wants them based on the limited information that we have so far. As to the timing in pregnancy, I think the biggest concern for pregnant women is getting COVID itself. And so there isn't any reason to wait until the end of the pregnancy in order to protect your baby. We don't even know if that'll work, but we know that COVID can cause more problems for pregnant women. And so I think, the best thing to do is, if you get the opportunity to get the vaccine, if you qualify for some other reason right now, there's no reason to try and time it in any particular way. Get it whenever you can. So far, the information about the durability how durable the immunity is limited because these vaccines have only been in use for a few months, but it doesn't appear that there's a rapid drop off in immunity. So you can expect if you got vaccinated, in your 3rd month of pregnancy, that you would still have immunity toward the end of the pregnancy. But that's also information that needs to continue to be gathered.
And one of the things, so the mRNA vaccine is really pretty unstable. I mean, I'm sure everybody's heard that it has to be kept at -70 degrees, and there's all which creates its own problems with distribution. But what that also means is that it's very hard for the vaccine, the mRNA, to remain stable in your body, and so they coat it in this sort of lipid layer, and the science suggests that after it's injected, it can't really even get into your bloodstream easily. So, and then even if it did, it won't cross the placental barrier. So even though we don't have data yet, we have science behind it from other things that suggest that this shouldn't be a problem. And I'll use that actually to jump into the breastfeeding, because I know that's a big question. Again, same issue. It doesn't appear that if a pregnant mom gets the vaccine that there's any substantive transmission into the breast milk. They are actually doing studies now to see if that's the case. But if you do a what if, even if it got into the breast milk, it has to be swallowed into the baby's stomach, and the acid in the stomach would absolutely degrade anything that possibly could have gotten into the breast milk. What we do know is that the immune response that it triggers, the antibodies that it triggers in the mother, those types of antibodies do cross into breast milk, and so give a passive immunity to the baby. And so there are recommendations that pregnant mothers that breastfeeding mothers do get vaccinated, because there is good data behind the idea that it would protect the baby.
So it does sound like there is an opportunity for passive immunity through breastfeeding, maybe not through an unborn fetus.
Yeah, we don't know how effective that immunity is likely to be. The types of antibodies that babies get in breast milk coat the lining of their throat and their respiratory tract, so it provides a surface barrier to the virus getting in, but the babies don't get antibodies floating around in their bloodstream through breast milk. That doesn't happen, and so it's not really full immunity in any sense of the word. We know for other respiratory viruses and diarrhea viruses that it can decrease the probability of infection, but once infection has happened, those antibodies don't really provide any benefit for the actual illness if it's occurring. Babies, however, do get antibodies through the placenta that go into their bloodstream. And so in the first weeks of life, newborns have antibodies that their mothers have given them that may protect them from a wide variety of infections. And there's no reason to think that'll be any different for coronavirus, but it hasn't been proven yet, but there's every reason to think that should be the case.
We have a similar question. It's more about COVID. So a little bit of a curveball, but I think you can handle it. Just wondering about the risk of newborn infants for contracting COVID, for having severe side effects of COVID. So sort of what's the toss up there, the risk from the vaccine or the risk from COVID?
Right. So there have been quite a few newborns who have gotten COVID in particularly early in the epidemic in parts of the country where disease was widespread early on. And the news is mostly good. I mean, most newborns who get exposed to COVID in the first few days of life, mostly because their mother or another family member was infected at the time. Most of those babies have done quite well. A large percentage of them don't even get sick. And the ones that do have mostly had milder symptoms, but there have been a few babies who have developed more significant respiratory problems or become ill. So it's certainly possible for newborns to get it. I think the question about safety of vaccinating the mother. There's little reason to think that any harm at all can happen to a newborn through that process. So, given that, even if the benefit of vaccinating the mother for the baby is on the low side, I think it's still worth taking advantage of.
So there's a question here, just to catch up on maybe missed part of what you had just mentioned about the length of immunity. And I'm not sure if it was you, Dr. Snedeker, or if Dr. De Silva had spoken to this. Just mentioned the length of immunity that the vaccine provides. Can you just restate that, please?
Sure.
Sure.
Go ahead, Audrey.
I don't know that anybody knows the answer to that, and it's going to take some time tracking it out. My understanding is that people at minimum 3 months, probably a couple of years. But one of the issues is that there may need to be boosters for new variants that come up. So we're not talking, one set immunity that's going to last you because things keep changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that the first human beings who ever got these vaccines got them back in April and May of last year. So, the longest possible information you could have is really only about 6 months in terms of follow-up. So whether the vaccine can protect for 1 year or 2 years or 5 years, there's no way to know that at the moment. And, we basically just have to wait on that. I did mention earlier, though, that antibody isn't really the whole story. And we use antibody levels as sort of a surrogate for infection because it's something that we can measure. But your immune system has lots of other tools too. And some of those may be stimulated by the vaccine, and that may give you memory that lasts for a long time, even if your antibody levels get lower and lower with time, so that your immune system may still remember that what the virus looks like and respond more quickly when you're exposed down the road. So antibody levels are it's something that we can test for, but it's not the whole story when it comes to protection from the vaccines.
Okay. So will this vaccine likely become a part of a standard immunization schedule for children? Will it be like a flu shot that we get annually, or is that still to be determined?
To be determined, yeah, definitely.
If I were a betting person, I would say probably there'll need to be boosters. But
I think a lot depends there on how durable the immunity turns out to be, and then how often new variants arise. The viruses differ tremendously from one another and how likely that is to happen. With flu, new variants appear almost every year. And it's one reason why the flu vaccine has to be modified from year to year to keep up with that. But there are other viruses like measles, for example, where there's really only one measles virus. There's only ever been one measles virus, and new mutants, new variants have never emerged, despite the fact that this virus has been with us for centuries. So, the devil is in those sorts of details as to whether one dose would be enough, or whether you would need boosters, or whether you would need to be boosted with a different vaccine because of variants that have emerged.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. So can we talk a little bit about transmission of the virus for vaccinated people? Still something that is being determined, I imagine, but do we know anything about how much the vaccine cuts down on transmission rates and what the risks will be for young children who are unable to be vaccinated, the risk of contracting it if the adults around them or the others around them are vaccinated?
It's a terrific question, and it's really the $64 question, because we want to know that people who are vaccinated can't transmit the virus, so that's the hope for bringing the pandemic to a close in the first place. We don't know that for humans yet, but we know from animal studies that when primates are given these vaccines, that their immunity seems to be durable, and it also seems to make them incapable of transmitting the virus. But this is a very difficult question to study in humans, because in a laboratory with primates, it's pretty easy. You can infect them experimentally after they've gotten the vaccine and then see what happens. We can't do that with people. And testing whether somebody can transmit virus is much more challenging than testing whether they have antibodies or not. You actually have to swab their noses when they're not sick and look for virus not only by the sorts of tests that we do for coronaviruses, which test for the virus RNA, but actually test to see if you can grow the virus out of those secretions. So those studies are very labor intensive, very expensive, very difficult to do, and difficult to get people to volunteer to have a swab stuck up their nose every week, which is basically what you have to do. So that information is not yet available. It will be happening because there are people in these clinical trials who are undergoing that sort of testing. But you can't do that with 30,000 people. So that's only happening with a small subset of people in these vaccine studies. And if it confirms the information that we already have from experimental animals, then the news is going to be very good because, as I said, in the animal situation, it looks like that is what these vaccines do. But we can't promise it in people yet until we know for sure, because we don't want people to let down their guard prematurely and stop wearing masks and things like that if it turns out that the vaccines aren't as effective at preventing transmission as we expect that they will be.
Okay. So even with the vaccine coming out, we should all still continue mask wearing, hand washing, and all of those other measures reducing gatherings.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Is that something, sorry, go ahead.
No, I noticed a question in the chat that's pertinent because the CDC just made a recommendation recently that people who have been vaccinated no longer need to quarantine if they're exposed. And so the question is, how can we know that if we don't know yet about transmission of the virus? And it's a great question, and it's a really important one. And the answer to that is that there's a little bit of risk involved in this recommendation, and there are some scientists that have expressed a little bit of concern that this may be premature given that exact question. But there is a lot of pressure right now on the economy and everything else for for people being out of work when they're exposed, when there's so much coronavirus disease around. And so it's a risk-benefit decision, and there's a lot more besides just the scientific data that goes into those sorts of recommendations. I think that recommendation will prove to be the right recommendation in the end, but the questioner is exactly correct. We don't actually have a complete, satisfactory, set of scientific data that proves that that's an okay thing to do. It seems like it will be very likely the right thing to do, but there is still a little bit of uncertainty, and the judgment has been made that that level of uncertainty is acceptable given all of the consequences that come from quarantining people, like pulling kids out of school and shutting down schools or workplaces or things like that, because all of those things are also important consequences of coronavirus infection.
Thank you. Thanks for addressing that. We had a similar question that came to us before the event live, asking, if you think it would be recommended that schools and other community settings continue to do measures such as keeping distance or requiring masks into the foreseeable future, into next fall, as schools make plans for the next school year.
I think until we know more, we need to be cautious about it. And I'm a total proponent of getting kids back in school for sure. But I think continuing to do it now doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be forever. And as more data comes out, the recommendations will change. With the priority of keeping everybody and keeping children safe. But certainly the hope is that it will allow kids to get back to school without all of the mitigating factors. I personally hope that kids and adults will continue to wear masks if they have a cold or if they have a runny nose. That schools and public places will be more careful about wiping down surfaces, and that some of the hygiene things that we've learned will continue and persist even past the pandemic, because they have also shown to decrease flu transmission and RSV transmission and all of the other infectious diseases that we are typically overrun with at this time of year.
Every parent knows that their kid is sick all winter long when they go to school, or at least has been in previous years. And we're learning now that there are things that you can do that are really socially acceptable, that will provide benefit. And I don't think we're going to go back to where we were before this pandemic, even if everybody gets vaccinated against coronavirus and coronavirus rates go down to acceptable levels. As Dr. De Silva said, I think attention to distancing and ventilation and hygiene and all of those things that we have become accustomed to doing now, there will be benefits from continuing to do those things down in the future.
Thank you. This is a question that's kind of tied into that. Since currently there aren't any vaccines for children, are there any other additional or different preventative things you would recommend for protecting children?
Yeah, I mean, all of the things that we've just been talking about provide some benefit. There is no intervention that's 100% effective, but the more of these things you layer on top of one another, the more you're decreasing the probability that you'll be exposed and infected. So, for kids who can't be vaccinated, wearing masks, washing hands, avoiding large gatherings, even in the family setting. In fact, especially in the family setting, because that's when people tend to let down their guard. Those are the sorts of things that clearly make a difference. And every additional layer of protection that you add further decreases the likelihood that you're going to be exposed.
And my understanding is it really works. If you look at Shannon, you may have more specific data, but my understanding is that there have been very few transmissions associated with the kids being in school because they've been really good about adhering to mask wearing and social distancing.
Yeah, I think largely the cases that have come through, it's been through non-school related reasons that folks have become sick.
Right.
Yeah, there is a question we have in our chat asking about, the risks of exposures for kids until they can get vaccinated and what kind of percentages. I think that means percentages of children being sick with COVID. Are we seeing that locally?
Yeah, nationally, the percentage of COVID cases that have occurred in children is roughly 8% of the total number of COVID cases that have happened. But excuse me, but those are the cases that are recognized and reported, and there are probably a lot of kids who've had coronavirus infection that haven't been sick enough to be recognized that that's what they've got. So I'm sure those numbers are quite a bit higher. I think for the most part, the infection rate in children is probably pretty similar to the infection rate in the general population, but kids are less likely than older adults to develop significant symptoms. They may get sick, they may get respiratory symptoms or fever, but serious illness is a lot less common in kids than it is in adults, although it certainly can happen. We've been fortunate in our county that we've not had a single child who has had a serious complication of COVID illness so far, knock on wood. And we know that lots of our patients have already had it. But and most of our listeners have probably heard of certain complications of COVID infection that can happen in kids, like the multisystem inflammatory disorder, or MISC. That's certainly a real thing. Fortunately, it's a very rare complication of COVID illness, but it is one to take very seriously.
Thank you. Actually, that is one of the questions we have on here. It's just asking about the risk that a child would develop those severe effects from the COVID infections, especially in particular the MISC. How does the risk of this infection compare with risk of flu?
Well, actually, flu is an instructive example. because annually in the United States over the last few decades, typically in a typical year, somewhere around 130 to 150 children would die of influenza, of the common flu. About half of those are kids who have risk factors for more severe flu illness, and about half are kids who didn't, just otherwise healthy kids. As of about a month ago, the last time I did this calculation, there were about that many pediatric deaths from COVID in the entire pandemic. So the mortality rate from COVID so far is about what we would expect from a typical flu year in kids. And so that, that I think puts some perspective on it. We certainly worry about COVID, and we don't want to lose any child to either flu or COVID. But the number of deaths that have happened from it have been very, very small indeed. As to the risk of MIS-C, it's kind of hard to know what the probability of that is in any one child who has COVID, because we don't really know what the denominator is, because so many kids have mild illness. But I did a back of the envelope calculation on this back last summer when MIS-C was first being seen in New York City. And we had a rough idea how many COVID cases had occurred in New York City at the time. And my back of the envelope calculation at the time was that if every child in Tompkins County developed COVID tomorrow, we might see perhaps 2 cases of MIS-C in the whole county. So it's really a very infrequent complication. It was something like 1 in 30,000 estimated cases, something like that. But that information is still being gathered, and we're also, people are starting to recognize that there may be milder forms of this that have to be included in those sorts of calculations. So it's a little bit of a moving target, but it's clearly quite rare. I think as of this week, there have been about 2,000 cases of MIS-C in the entire United States for the entire pandemic. So.
That's helpful. That gives us a little bit of more tangible information from stories that we may be hearing in the news that are alarming, but having that information in hand is definitely helpful. So thank you for doing that calculation for us. Okay. Here's a question about the vaccine in particular. And of course, studies are just ongoing now, but given maybe based on what's been occurring with adults who've been vaccinated, if children have experienced negative side effects from other vaccines in the past, will that translate to potential for reactions to this vaccine?
I wouldn't say that that's likely, but it depends a little bit on what sort of side effects we're talking about. There's lots of different side effects that can happen after vaccination, most of which are minor. But if, for example, if your child had a red swollen arm after an earlier vaccination, there isn't any reason to think that that would be any more likely or less likely with a COVID vaccine than with any of the other vaccines that we give kids routinely. So we don't typically see, for example, if a kid has a tetanus booster and they get a sore arm, and then they get a meningitis vaccine, they're no more likely to get a sore arm from the meningitis vaccine than an average kid would be. So for the most part, that doesn't seem to be predictive. But again, it depends a little bit on what sort of side effects you're talking about.
Maybe allergic reactions. I'm not sure if that's what they meant by their question.
Well, allergic reactions to vaccinations are very rare, but they do happen. I think the estimate for the COVID vaccine is that allergic reactions so far in the United States have been happening at a rate of about 2 reactions per million doses that have been given so far, at least, and no fatal allergic reactions have occurred yet at all. These are mainly things like hives or wheezing or things like that would be considered anaphylaxis. We don't think that there is any likelihood that having had an allergic vaccine reaction to another vaccine would increase the likelihood of an allergic reaction to the COVID vaccine, particularly since these vaccines are so different from all the other vaccines that we use. There really isn't any likelihood of overlap. And for all of the other vaccines that we use, having an allergic reaction to one does not appear to increase the likelihood of an allergic reaction to another. The only difference for people right now who are getting COVID vaccine, if they have had an allergic reaction to a previous vaccine of some other kind, is that they have to wait around a little longer after they're vaccinated, a half hour instead of 15 minutes. But otherwise, there's no other precautions need to be taken other than you have to be prepared to deal with an allergic reaction if one occurs.
Thank you. This is a question about breastfeeding, but more of a question about, do you know if the studies are looking into impacts on breast milk supply? So we already talked about, transmission of the virus or the vaccine, I'm sorry, through breastfeeding is not likely.
I'm not aware of any information about that at all. Are you, Audrey?
I'm not.
I mean, I don't think there's any evidence that any other vaccines that are given to breastfeeding mothers have a major impact on breast milk supply. So there's no particular reason to think that that should happen. I suppose if you became very ill after vaccination, if you had a fever that lasted for days and you felt unwell and didn't eat and drink adequately, perhaps there could be a transient effect on breast milk supply that, if the supply were tenuous to begin with, could potentially be an issue. But I don't really think that should be a major concern.
That makes sense. Thank you. Okay. My son, not me, I'm speaking for an attendee. She shares that her son is 1.5 years old. What's the best guess on when the vaccine will be available? Maybe when he's 4, or
that would be a good one to take to Vegas. I don't think I can say when, but I think I can predict with some confidence that the earliest that could happen would probably be early next year sometime. Okay. Or early 2022. I think that would be the earliest that might be possible. And I don't know if vaccine studies will go down to that age range. They might only go down to age 2. One of the issues with designing studies like this for kids is that because COVID tends to be a less severe illness in kids, the balance of risk versus benefit is a little different than it is for older adults. And so how young do we want to go? How hard do we want to push to vaccinate kids? I think is a legitimate question, because a 1.5-year-old who gets COVID is not terribly likely to, develop a very serious illness outside of the rare complications that we've talked about. So you have to weigh the possibility of vaccine side effects, which mostly are not serious, but nonetheless, all of that goes into those sorts of considerations. So, and I don't know what the minimum age for vaccination is likely to be. For the youngest vaccine that we give to kids, we give at birth, hepatitis B vaccine. Other vaccines like flu we can give down to 6 months, but there's some other vaccines we use that aren't given to kids under 2, and in some cases aren't given to kids under 16. So those are policy decisions, and I'm not privy right now to to the plans for how those will be studied and exactly when.
Thank you. This is a question, we've talked a lot about children. This is more focused on adolescents. It reads, my teenage children read a lot about COVID-19, sometimes from not so great sources on social media. They are not sure that they want to get vaccinated and have a lot of anxiety about it. What can I do to help them better understand the science?
Well, you sent this question to us beforehand, so I did a little bit of quick looking. I think probably the best way is to meet them where they are and give them some social media sources. There are some really good YouTube videos explaining the science behind it, and then there's a group actually that I found called Team Halo, which is a bunch of young scientists from all over the world that have a TikTok group, and they produce short videos explaining things about the vaccine, sort of designed to help with fears. And I am happy to post that in the chat box if people would like these the links. But there's a lot of serious disinformation out there right now. One of the ones that I've been hearing a lot about is fears amongst teenage girls that that the vaccine is going to make them infertile. Which, while I'm putting this in, Jeff, do you want to address that?
Yeah,
yeah,
that sort of disinformation has been applied to lots of other vaccines too. In Africa, that's been used by militant groups to discourage people from getting polio vaccine. And there is no vaccine that causes infertility, and there's no reason to think that these will either. I think when it comes to kids who have questions like that, it's, as Dr. De Silva said, it's important to meet them where they are, take their questions seriously, and guide them to places where they can get good, reliable information. The same places that you're going to, and I think for a lot of kids, they have trouble filtering what they're, and not just kids, adults too, some trouble filtering what they see online and figuring out what are reliable sources and what are not reliable sources. Seeing it on the internet is like saying, well, I read it on a poster or something. That doesn't necessarily make it true, depending on whether the information is validated or not. The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia has a terrific website for people who have concerns about all manner of vaccinations, not just the COVID vaccine. But vaccine.chop.edu is the website. I'll put that in the chat also. But they sort of have point-by-point responses to a lot of the vaccine hesitancy questions that come up. And those can be very useful when when somebody says, oh, I heard that vaccine X does this. Their website has good resources for the information that proves that that's not true, and explanations of why it's not true, and even citations, so that if people want to go to the actual research that's been done, they can investigate it on their own.
Great, thank you. And thanks for putting those resources into the chat box. I'm gonna do one more question out of our Q&A and then open up the lines for if anyone wants to ask their questions out loud. We do have one phone-in caller, so I want to give that person an opportunity to ask a question if they need to. So this is a question about if the vaccine is primarily only preventing major complications. We don't know if it's reducing transmission rate. Are there concerns about sending children to school? If the adults around them are vaccinated, does that decrease their risks, or are there concerns still? Maybe this goes back to continuing those measures of mask wearing, distancing, hand washing, hygiene.
I think there are concerns still until we know more about how much it decreases actual transmission. And my understanding is that we think it does decrease transmission. It's just that there's no data to say it absolutely does, and so we're being cautious until we have that information. So yeah, until we have that, I think schools need to continue with social distancing. But it does also looks like it works, like what the schools are doing really works to decrease transmission. And the biggest risk to children is getting sick from their family members.
Great, thank you for that answer. To our phone-in caller, I'm going to briefly open up your phone line just in case you have a question. If you do not, we'll just all listen quietly for a quick minute, but I would like to just allow you the opportunity to talk. So open that up for you. You're currently muted, so if you do have a question, just unmute and feel free to ask. Okay, looks like no questions. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, there were a couple in the Q&A that I would comment on briefly.
Sure,
There was a
yeah.
question about the rate of long haul COVID
Yep.
or persisting symptoms.
Yep.
I don't think we know yet how the likelihood of that in pediatrics compares to adults, because the number of kids who've had major COVID illness is still on the small side. I've not been hearing a lot about that. And none of my patients that I know who have had COVID, and of course none have been sick enough to be hospitalized, but I've had a number that have been sick for a week or so forth. Nobody's had any lingering symptoms so far. There was a question about, back to MISC, about are we aware in our region about this and what measures are we taking? We're certainly aware of it, and we have our antenna up for kids who have unusual symptoms that could potentially be a sign of this. We've not had any cases in Tompkins County. There have been some other cases in surrounding counties, and I know that the pediatric medical centers up in Syracuse and Rochester are seeing a number of cases of this. So it's definitely out there, and we are on the lookout for it.
Another question in the Q&A that I think we have time to get through. Are infants at greater, lesser, or same risk for severe COVID effects compared to children aged 4 to 6?
Yeah, they probably slightly lower risk, but I don't think there's apt to be a large difference there. As kids get older, they start to be a little bit more like adults, and so the rates of COVID complications in adolescence is probably not terribly dissimilar from young healthy adults, unless they have some underlying risk factor.
And there's one more question in our Q&A. Are there other vaccines that are widespread with similar technology that we can sort of make predictions off of?
No. Yeah, no, these are new. There was a vaccine developed against the original SARS using mRNA technology that was studied in humans, but it never got into widespread use because that form of SARS dissipated and didn't become widespread. So there wasn't any reason to pursue that as a widely administered vaccine. So no, this is a new breed of vaccine, and it's very exciting in a number of ways because it's a technology that is very flexible. With most of the other vaccines we use, if a new strain of virus comes up, you almost have to go back to the drawing board and come up with something new. And these technologies allow the manufacturer to make small changes in the sequence that adapt to those variants, if you like, and scale up the manufacturing very, very quickly. Now that you still have to reevaluate every time you make a change that it hasn't changed the safety profile of the vaccine in some way, but it really is. It's a wonderful new technology that has some real advantages compared to the way vaccines have been developed in the past. And I think there are going to be many other vaccines like this coming down the pipeline for other things as well.
I think I just read that either Pfizer or Moderna, I don't remember which one, is already starting development of a vaccine against the South African variant, and they expect it will only take 6 weeks to get that up and running if they need to. Yeah, it's a more precise and less expensive way of creating vaccine that is very targeted, and so I think it's not, these aren't the last ones we're going to see of the mRNA vaccines.
And the question in the chat also about long-term symptoms, not necessarily MISC, but things like effects on the heart and kidneys and that sort of thing. It's definitely something we're on the lookout for. Information is still being gathered about this. We know that there have been isolated instances of athletes, for example, who have had COVID illness where they've developed heart issues afterward that were potentially serious. And because these studies are still underway and they're epidemiologic studies, we don't have a lot of information yet. It doesn't appear to be common in kids, but we are definitely on the lookout for it. And there are recommendations coming down the pipeline now for screening young athletes after they've had COVID illness to make sure it's safe for them to go back to sports and things of that nature. But there's still a lot more to be learned about this.
And I actually think, I believe most of the school districts in the area certainly for are requesting clearance for students if they have had COVID to return to sports. So you may see those coming from your school districts, those of you that have kids.
Right, and those, you know, those guidelines for monitoring and follow-up are being reevaluated and reformulated as we go along. So, you know, things may change there as more information comes to light.
All right. Wow, I think we've gotten through the Q&A. So kind of to summarize, you know, it sounds like we need to have continued patience as we wait for the vaccine to progress through its clinical trials. It's important for adults to be vaccinated to give as much protection as we can to our families, and continue mask wearing, hand washing, reduce gatherings, continue all of that as we move through this year. And sounds like, you know, research is developing and more is being learned every day. So thank you both for sharing all of your wisdom with us today. Thank you to all of our participants who have joined us. I don't know if either of you, Dr. DeSilva, Dr. Snedeker, if you have any last minute things that you want to share with our audience before we sign off today.
I would just say hang in there. It's a long, slow process, but we're getting there, and you know, don't let your guard down, but we are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I would echo that. And, you know, as other questions come up, you know, your pediatrician and your own physician can be resources to you in evaluating new information and making your own decisions about what's best for your kids. You know, right. Every kid is an individual, and you know, as vaccine eligibility ages start to drop, and we have kids who have medical conditions that you know, may put them at risk for more severe COVID, we're definitely going to be interested in helping out. We hope we'll be able to provide vaccine in our office someday. We're not there yet. We can't get it. and because of the age limits right now, it doesn't make sense for us to have it. But as those age limits come down, hopefully it'll be something in the future that you can get through your pediatrician's office.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Please do stay tuned into announcements and alerts from the Tompkins County Health Department. You can sign up for those on the website if you're interested in receiving them. You can join us tonight at 5 o'clock for a COVID-19 updates town hall with Public Health Director Frank Krupa from the Health Department, along with County Administrator Jason Molino, to give updates on distribution and all the questions associated with that. That will be live streamed on the county's YouTube channel. So you can just Google Tompkins County YouTube and it'll pop right up. Thanks again for joining us today, and be safe. Thank you.
Bye.